Welcome everyone to Mind Medicine Australia's webinar series. We have a very exciting webinar this evening with Patrycja Slawuta and Dr. Eli Kotler, both of whom are on Mind Medicine Australia's advisory panel, and we'll be introducing them shortly. We're just going to start off just by giving you just some short introductory comments about Mind Medicine Australia. And firstly, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the elders, wisdom, traditions, cultures and communities who have used these medicines for thousands of years for their intelligence and healing potential. With that in mind, Ilan, if we could go to the presentation slides and get going with those, and then I'll introduce the presenters. Next one, thank you. So just a reminder to all of you that Mind Medicine Australia is focused on the medicinal use of these medicines for mental illnesses, and we don't encourage or facilitate illegal use of psychedelics or plant medicines. We are recording this webinar, and we have, just back one slide, thank you. We have a YouTube channel in which you can watch all of the previous webinars and this webinar and our upcoming webinars as well. Next slide, please. So the reason why we're here is because mental illness is now at such alarming levels and getting worse in Australia and the rest of the world. But we're in Australia, so we will talk about Australia tonight. So before the pandemic, these were the statistics. 1 in 5 Australian adults have a chronic mental illness. Obviously, that will have increased enormously due to the current crisis. 1 in 8 Australians were on antidepressants before the crisis, including 1 in 4 older Australians, and children as young as 5 being prescribed antidepressants. It's estimated that 1 in 2 of us will experience a mental illness in our lifetime, and the most common mental illnesses are PTSD, anxiety disorders, depression, and substance use disorders. Next slide, thank you. We're a registered charity, and the charity was founded by my husband, Peter Hunt, and myself to broaden the treatment paradigm available to medical practitioners and their patients by establishing safe, accessible and effective medicine-assisted therapies in Australia for major mental illnesses. Our primary focus at the moment is on medicinal psilocybin and medicinal MDMA. But in our next webinar, you'll be hearing about some of the other medicines that are having particular good outcomes for addictions, including ketamine and ibogaine as well. And ayahuasca, of course, is another psychedelic medicine that is also having a lot of research into its efficacy at the moment. So our indication of success is that these therapies become an integral part of our mental health system, with high remission rates leading to substantial improvement in our mental health statistics, and that these medicines are accessible and affordable to all Australians in need and no matter where they're located. Next slide. So unfortunately, there's been no innovation in treatments for mental illness in virtually 50 years. So in the case of depression, only a maximum of 35% of sufferers experience remission from either pharmacotherapy, which is primarily antidepressants or antipsychotics, or psychotherapy. Many patients relapse after treatment stops, and there's many side effects and withdrawal symptoms from antidepressants and a number of these other medicines. In the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, it's even harder to treat, so the remission rates are even lower. So more of the same is not going to solve the problem. And this is why we set up Mind Medicine Australia, because we wanted to make sure that there were treatments available to help the millions of people who are suffering in this country with mental illness. And it seems very unfair to withhold medicines from patients when they're actually available. and they're available in other countries legally as well. Next slide. So our primary focus on two broad types of medicine-assisted psychotherapies, the medicinal psilocybin for depression and potentially obsessive compulsive disorder and addiction. I'm sorry for the smallness of the writing on some of these slides. I'm not quite sure what's happened to the slides. And medicinal MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder and also addictions. The wonderful thing about these medicines is they only require 2 to 3 dose sessions, in contrast to conventional treatments which involve daily medications or weekly psychotherapy, often for decades or a lifetime. These medicines are also curative, whereas current existing treatments are mainly palliative. They're considered very safe in a medically controlled environment and non-addictive. Both medicines have been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the Food and Drug Administration in the US to fast-track the approval process for them to become prescription medicines. And MDMA has just passed through a number of its final hoops and is expected to be prescribable in the US within 18 months. And Australia is expected to follow suit in terms of prescribing both psilocybin and MDMA, which will both most likely be prescribable in the next 18 months in the case of MDMA and up to 2.5 years for psilocybin. Breakthrough therapy designation is also only granted where medicines are considered vastly superior to existing treatments. Next slide. So our focus is on 4 key strategic areas at Mind Medicine Australia. Awareness and knowledge building, so these webinars are part of that strategic pillar. So we run regular educational events, information sessions. We run sessions like these in partnerships with other organisations, including politicians, including medical centres and hospitals, other charities, and providing as much information and education as we can. We also had planned a major international medical summit for November this year, but that is going to be postponed till 2021, and we will announce the dates very soon. We have a wonderfully exciting lineup of international speakers, so we want to make sure that they can be here in person and that all of you can meet them when you come to the summit. We're also interested in relevant novel research, and we have state and regional chapters. At the moment, nearly 30 of them around Australia and New Zealand. So please join one of our chapters or start one in a location where you are if you don't have one. And these are to build further awareness, education, help with fundraising and so on. In terms of fundraising, we're totally funded by philanthropy. So we urge you all to be as generous as possible to help make sure these medicines can be available as soon as possible. We also have launched a therapist professional development program, a certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies. And the first intake of that will be in January and the second in July. It's a 4-month part-time course, face-to-face and online. And we've brought Renee Harvey, a leading clinical psychologist from Imperial College in London who worked on the psilocybin trials with Robin Carhart-Harris and David Nutt, to Australia to design and manage this program. And we've nearly filled the first intake with a wonderful group of psychiatrists, psychologists, drug and addiction specialists, GPs, physicians, mental health nurses, psychotherapists and others. So we encourage you, if you're thinking about applying for this certificate, to do so as soon as possible. We're also looking at setting up an Asia Pacific Centre for emerging mental health therapies, applied research and development, manufacturing and supply chains, growing these medicines potentially in Australia, also looking at access pathways for the medicines. And then finally, we're looking at the preferred legal and ethical frameworks for these medicines. So we've just put in rescheduling applications for both MDMA and psilocybin. And later this month, we'll be letting you all know when the submissions go public. So there'll be a period of consultation where you can put in public submissions about the urgent need for these medicines to be available. The medicines are also currently available through the SASB scheme, which was used also to make cannabis available on a case-by-case basis for doctors and their patients. So we're very pleased to say that a number of psychiatrists and doctors have started to get approvals to use psilocybin and MDMA for their patients on a case-by-case basis. And our focus is wholly clinical. So with that, I'm now going to introduce our wonderful presenters for tonight. And they are, and Ilan, if you go to the presentation now, that'd be great. So they are Patrycja Slawuta and Dr. Eli Kotler. And I've known Patrycja for a number of years now. We've worked and collaborated together many occasions. Patrycja is a psychologist and an incredibly intelligent and insightful human being. And yes, I mean, she knows all about hacking people's brains, and I'll let her give you a bit more context. But her biography is on our website, as is Dr. Eli Kotler. Dr. Eli Kotler is a specialist in addiction medicine and looks after many patients with addictions at Malvern Private Hospital and elsewhere. And we're thrilled to have him involved in this seminar. The way the seminar will work is Patrycja will do a short introduction to the concept of the psychology of a hungry ghost, addiction, acceptance, and aliveness. And then she's going to interview Eli with some specific questions. And then we're going to open the floor for Q&A and have some final concluding remarks. So welcome all, and welcome Patrycja.
Beautiful, thank you so much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. I'm actually not in US right now. I'm in Perth, so for those of you who know, the sunset is right behind me. I'm in Fremantle. And we decided to make this interactive because a lot of webinars are just slides and talking heads. And so very quickly, I will be a talking head for probably 7 to 10 minutes, talk in general about how I see it as a psychologist, the psychology of addiction. And then we'll have Eli, myself interview Eli as a psychologist interviewing psychiatrists. So buckle up because it will be a lot of interesting talk. And I think a lot of kind of nuggets of wisdom that hopefully will shed some light on the nature of addiction and the hungry ghost. And so if I can get my slides, or I can share them myself. Maybe I should share them myself. There you go. Sorry. I did this. There we go. Is this visible to everybody? Okay. So the psychology of the hungry ghost, this is a term coined initially. The hungry ghost comes from actually Chinese culture and Buddhist culture, but how it's used in psychology is the sense of never enough. I'm a psychologist. I work with high performance individuals, some of the most exciting company startups and individuals in the world, people who break records, people who hustle in New York City, where I spent 13 years. Eli will go more into kind of the clinical addiction. I will look at just the hungry ghost that we all have. And how it shows itself pretty much in everybody that I've seen so far. And so 3 take-home messages that we will dive into over this webinar. The first one is that hungry ghost. We all have a hungry ghost, and it comes in all shapes, colors, sizes, but the bottom line that it's always hungry. And the hungry ghost can mean more money. It can mean more accomplishment, more academic titles. It can mean whatever. It also might mean, more love. And so the bottom line is it's based on scarcity mindset. There's not enough. I actually need more. Where the hungry ghosts come from, it comes from the archetypical primal wound. And in psychology, we say that the society can hurt us in 3 ways. We can be shamed, we can be betrayed, or we can be abandoned. And so those 3 are usually the 3 you would see in more serious addiction, but I also see working with high-performing individuals that when you dive really back behind what drives them, it's one of those 3. And so just for the purpose of this webinar, it might be just good for you to think which one of the three is potentially feeding your hungry ghost. And then there's the ability of turning ghosts into genie. Both start with G, and that's not only that, but it's actually the whole process of meaningful integration that we talk about in neuroscience and psychology is the ability to turn ghosts into genie. So something that scares us and that makes us restless, but it's also something that can actually fulfill our wishes and be the drive in life. And so I'll talk about all three very briefly now. The big question that, you know, philosophers and psychologists have been asking, what it actually means to be human. There are certain unique human capacities that we have. First of all, we have existential anxiety. We know we will die. And that awareness of that, if you're in Victoria, if you're in some of the places where actually COVID is striking right now, this is much more visible than in other places. Here in WA, it's not that visible, and yet it is still in the back of our mind. The existential anxiety drives a lot of our behavior subconsciously. We all searching for meaning, and that's the famous book by Viktor Frankl. He says, you know, men search for meaning, and our quest for meaning is our quest for understanding purpose and some kind of peace in life. And then finally, we all suffer. There's the difference between pain and suffering. Viktor Frankl also says that there is beauty in human suffering, and we can, if we sanctify it, we can actually move beyond the hungry ghost. But what else does it mean to be human? It also means we have something called hope, compassion, collaboration, kindness, and finally we have love and aliveness. And so those are all uniquely human traits. You know, some of us might disagree and say, you know, our cat or our dog has great compassion and love for us. But overall, we see it as uniquely human capacities. And so this is the difference between hungry ghosts and the genie. And so how we hurt is the three archetypical wounds. We are being shamed. And in psychology, we say shame begets shame. We're being betrayed or feel like we have been betrayed. The society or close ones have betrayed us. Or we have been abandoned in many ways. It doesn't have to be physical abandonment. It could have been emotional abandonment. And the question really is not why the behavior. The question is not why the addiction, but the question is why the pain. Where does the pain come from? And after having a couple chats with Eli, that seems to be a very prevalent thing among the patients that he sees, going back to the root of pain. And not really, the behavior can be, the behavior that comes from the pain is different. You know, for some of us, it's the drive, like I used to have in Manhattan. And for some others is, you know, it's endless amounts of sex or endless amounts of alcohol. So when you think about trauma, and we will dive into trauma tends to do three things. It freezes things, and it freezes parts of ourselves in which they don't grow anymore, and they freeze in a certain age. It flattens time. In other words, the trauma keeps repeating itself every time we look into it. And then it fragments time. And so the past is not integrated into present. And that is the disruption in perception of time is something that's very common in addiction. In psychology, we also talk about window of tolerance. Now, when you see that trauma is present, there are two ways that you can notice that there's some kind of wound that has happened. First of all, is overreaction. I don't know how many of you have been in a relationship where you say something and there's this overreaction suddenly, and you're like, well, this is so disproportional to the stimuli. So the system or the person can go into chaos, overreaction, or you can go into complete numbness and rigidity. And that soft space of, we call a window of tolerance, is the space where we can actually, the system or the human system or the nervous system works really well. We call it the window of tolerance. How much discomfort, how much being with life can we tolerate? Ultimately, what we try to do in therapy, ultimately what we try to do with clients is make that window of tolerance a little bit bigger so that people can perceive the life a little bit more and have a little bit more flexibility, a little bit margin of flexibility, and have more options than just one option of responding. Ultimately, also, what we look at is our ability to relate to life itself. And I took this hedgehog, which I grew up in Poland, and we used to have a lot of hedgehogs. And those of you who know hedgehogs, they they're, you know, spiky, so you're not supposed to touch them. But when you actually touch them in the right way, they have very soft underbelly, and you can actually take the soft underbelly and take it on your hand. And so this is really how we relate to life. The life and the stories that we create can be painful and hurtful, or if we do it skillfully, we can touch a soft underbelly. And somebody very nicely described the entire process of psychotherapy and working with life overall is, are our actions actually prolonging suffering, or are they easing pain? And so when we come to the human brain, and we'll talk a little bit more about the human brain, its ultimate is a meaning-making machine. How do we make meaning of what happened to us in the past? And Peter Levine, who is the father of trauma work, he actually says, here's a beautiful quote, he says, what's true and then the truth? And he says that the thing that's true and then the truth is the story. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing, a lot of the work with both high-performing people, but in general in life, it is what is the story that we are creating. And so if we take a premise that actually trauma happens in relationship, and very often close, intimate relationships, trauma also heals in relationships. And there are two beautiful quotes saying that where there's love, there's life. And so what we see in a lot of practice, in a lot of addiction treatment, is actually expanding the love and actually giving love and receiving love. And then finally it's creating hope. And Stephen Hawking says, where there is life, there is hope. And I think those two really nicely flow one to another. There's also very interesting research on psilocybin. And I was there when it happened in NYU around the cancer anxiety. It was work with palliative patients sick with cancer. In other words, they were dying and they had huge anxiety and huge depression. And psilocybin was being administered. It was probably the first study after years that was done like that. And they found three things that universally people experienced three things. The first one is universal love, and the love that just held them. And they said they felt like children being held by love. And love, the flow of love, the flow of compassion and kindness is something very important in addiction treatment. The second one was transcendence. They believe that there's something bigger than themselves, that they are the body, but there's something bigger than the body. And then finally is forgiveness. And so as you can see, all three has to do with the intimate relationship. In a way, it's our intimate relationship with life. And so one important thing that Eli and I will be talking about in the Q&A session is about self-esteem. Self-esteem is, do you believe you have a right to be in this world and you actually have something to contribute, not by doing anything, but just by being. And I call self-esteem is the immune system of the mind. Just as our body has an immune system, our mind as well has an immune system, and that's called self-esteem. And there's a whole bunch of beautiful work done in psychology around self-esteem. And then finally, I'm going to end with a quote from Jack Kornfield, who's a psychiatrist and a Buddhist, actually, in Buddhist psychology. And he reframed one quote from Buddha, and he says, in the end, you know, when the end comes, and it comes for all of us, and I think that's a beautiful just lesson for everybody for life. In the end, only three things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things not meant for you. And so this is about love, this is about gentleness and believing in something bigger than us. And finally, of letting go of that hungry ghost and actually potentially turning it into a genie. And so with this, I will end my very, very short presentation, and we'll move on to conversation with Eli, which will be a conversation, a psychologist interviewing a psychiatrist. So I'm very much looking for that.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
Now we just need to see you.
Can't see me? I can see me.
I can't see you. Ilan, could we see Eli?
Here we go.
Hello.
Excellent. Hi, Eli.
How you doing?
Thank you so much for being part of this webinar. Fascinating, you know, conversation we're looking forward to very much. I'll leave it to you now to go ahead with your interview of psychologist interviewing psychiatrist. Sorry.
Psychiatrist, I know, he's like a level up from me. He's a medical doctor. So first question, so what is addiction actually about? Is it about pleasure or is it about pain?
Okay, so I would say that substance use, alcohol use is about pleasure, but addiction is 100% about pain, and I want to be very definitive about that. I've seen literally thousands of people with addictions, and I haven't seen one that does not have emotional pain that they haven't worked through, but that there is also a clear connection between their emotional pain and their addiction. And I want to just talk a little bit about that connection. But first, we thought it would be important to bust a couple of myths about addiction. And one of the myths is that dopamine is about dopamine. That dopamine is a reward. The dopamine circuits are the reward circuitry of the brain. And so I just want to bust this myth for anyone listening and anyone who's interested. Because there are things that we seek and there are things that we consume and we enjoy them. So if I'm really, really hungry, I'm going to go look for food, and that feels really good. And that's my dopamine system. My dopamine system is the seeking system or the wanting system. And then I eat the food and it's very yummy and I feel really good. And that's not dopamine. If anything, dopamine decreases at that time. And this is one of the reasons why I think that there is a myth out there that addiction is about pleasure, because there's a myth that dopamine is about pleasure, and dopamine is not about pleasure. So we thought it was important to bust that myth straight away. But now getting back to pain. Pain, as Patty said, pain is very, very, very core to being human. We all have pain. And our minds are amazing at avoiding pain. They are really, really amazing at avoiding pain. This has been the core of psychoanalytic theory for over 100 years, and science is slowly catching up as well. We now know scientifically that we do all sorts of amazing and crazy things to avoid pain, and we have a biological imperative to avoid pain. And addiction, particularly with substances and alcohol, is probably the most powerful way we avoid pain, because they go straight into the emotional circuits and light up those emotional circuits, including, for example, the opiate circuits, which are about, mummy hugging little baby and baby feels loved, and the opiates go off, the endogenous opiates go off. So this is a very, very powerful way of feeling good, but it's not about the feeling good. It's about running away from pain. And one really, really important point that I want to get across is that we all have pain, every single human, and we all also unconsciously avoid pain with compulsive behaviors. And this, Patty, is starting to get to what you talk about the hungry ghosts. But I just wanted to give a couple of examples to hopefully help people relate, because I don't want this to just be a theoretical, I don't want this just to be interesting theory. Hopefully people can relate. And part of what we wanted to do here is destigmatize addiction. And we can do that by allowing everyone to realize that they have addictions. I have addictions. Every single human has addictions. And these are the compulsive things we do to avoid pain. And I wanted to bring a couple of examples to hopefully make it a little bit real for people and relatable. So the first one I want to talk about is anger. It's an interesting idea. It's not my idea, but you can divide addictions into internal addictions and external addictions. So think about anger. Think about the last time someone you love hurt you. They said something mean, they ignored you, whatever they did. Odds are you felt anger at that moment. And if someone asked you at that moment why you feel anger, your monkey brain would give a nice, clever rationalization, something like, she was rude to me, so I got angry. But what's really happening, if you have the courage to sit with yourself and sit with your emotions, what's really happening is that, 95% chance, I don't have to tell you, you can try it yourself, is that when the person was rude to you, you probably felt a painful emotion like loneliness, rejection, abandonment, fear, things like that. And then the anger flips in to overpower those emotions to make you feel safe and in control. And I can hurt you just like you hurt me. And I no longer have to sit with my pain, my rejection and my loneliness. So my mind flips it to anger. But it does it so quickly that I don't know that. And so what's happening in that moment is that my mind is using anger compulsively to help me deal with a painful emotion. But because it happens non-consciously, I don't realize it. And this is exactly the same with addictions. When I first meet people with addictions and I ask them, why do you drink, why do you use, they might just say, I'm bored, or, I enjoy it, and they're not aware of their pain. And that's because we all hide from our pain. The mind is has amazing mechanisms. We can call them defense mechanisms or whatever we want to call them to avoid pain. But the tricky bit is that it happens out of our awareness. And so we're often not aware, well, we're not aware of it until we force ourselves to have the courage to sit with ourselves and sit with our pain. And so the first point that we wanted to make is that emotional pain leads to compulsive reactions. Those reactions can be internal, like anger and all the personality disorders and defense mechanisms that happens around that, or they can be external. And these are all the behavioral addictions and the substance and alcohol addictions that end up being compulsive behaviors. And they are compulsive ways to get us away from our emotional pain, even if we don't know it, because our mind has repressed the pain. So we're not aware of it anymore. I'm thirsty.
Thank you. And yes, please have a drink. Water. I think at the end, when we talk about integration, which is absolutely the crux of the matter of dealing with addiction, we will talk about how do you actually stay with the pain, because that's also what the brain hates the most, where we build every single behavioral defense and psychological defense is not to feel that pain. And yet there are ways of being with it and making friends with it. Ultimately taming it and turning it into our friend. And because there's a lot of wisdom in it also, if we're willing to go there. You know, as they say, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. So very often, anyway, moving on.
I might just say one thing there, because I think it's so important.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. On what you just said there, you know, often people with a lot of pain and trauma, and they come in for some treatment, and maybe they realized already, or they realize right now that they've been running away from their pain for years and years. And they say, I don't know what to do. I keep, I'm running and I don't know where to run. And so what I tell them, not to sound too corny, but is they have to turn around and face the pain. And once they can do that, they can heal. So it's just, I didn't want to forget to say that.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. So let's talk about the big question, nature versus nurture. I get it all the time. I wonder what's the answer of a psychiatrist. Okay,
so yeah, this was another myth that we wanted to bust. And this is a particular, anyway, yeah, this annoys me a little bit. So I really wanted to mention this one, because a lot of people come to me and, in my hospital, we're all about, the pain and the childhood and the working through all this stuff. And then people will say to me, yeah, but it's genetic. Like, I'm an alcoholic because it's in my gene. My parents were genes and I'm an alcoholic. And that's bad because one, it's false, which I'll talk about now, but two, it gets rid of hope. Because if you think it's in your genes, then you're just destined to be an alcoholic forever, and that's it. And there's nothing you can do about it. So what's the point of working through the pain and integrating everything when it's just genetic? So first of all, it takes away hope, but second of all, it's false and it's not true. And I'll just say three quick things about that. The first thing is, and I have confirmed this with a very esteemed geneticist. So this is not a psychiatrist saying this, this is coming from the lips of a geneticist over email. And you can look anyone interested in this stuff can look it up themselves and research it. It is impossible to inherit a complex behavior which is dependent on the environment. So in other words.
Yeah, you have to unpack that.
Yes, I have to unpack that. Okay, so here's an example. Let's say I have all the genetic loadings for, alcoholism in the world. My great-grandparents, my great-great-great-grandparents, all the way back to Adam, they were all alcoholics on both sides. But then my parents decide to move to Saudi Arabia, and I literally can't find any alcohol. So I was born in Saudi Arabia. There is no way I can become an alcoholic. I just can't be, because it's 100, the addiction to alcoholism is 100% dependent on the environment. So it's impossible to inherit a gene or many genes for alcoholism. What I can inherit is some type of predisposition to becoming an alcoholic. But the truth is that right now, no one knows what that is and no one knows how to measure it. But so the first point I want to make is that it is impossible it's just impossible to inherit something that is 100% reliant on the environment. I can inherit a predisposition, but I can't inherit the behavior because it's totally reliant on the environment. And I hope that makes a bit of sense. The second point is, and this we won't spend a lot of time on, but again, if people are interested, I really encourage you to look into it for yourself or your loved ones or just out of interest. There is a very significant misunderstanding of twin studies, which is where people get quotes like, you know, addictions are 50% heritable or whatever people say. Twin studies and heritability does not measure cause. It measures something else. We think it measures cause, but it actually doesn't. Heritability is not a measure of cause. It's a measure of variance in a particular population. Whatever it measures, that's not what we're going to talk about today, but it does not measure cause. All that these studies show is that there is some genetic aspect to addictions, which we know anyway, but that's what the studies show. They do not measure cause. And the third thing I want to say is that, you know, saying that addictions are genetic is also false, because we know now, we're smarter than we used to be, and we know now that everything is a gene-environment interaction and epigenetics. They don't occur in isolation, genes and the environment. So there is always an environmental trigger to these things. And as best we know, the environmental trigger is trauma, which we will dive into a little bit. And that's what I wanted to say.
Now, I think we can dive now. Yes, interaction. That's always the answer I give. Anybody who understands statistics or math understands that interaction means you take things and they do. It's almost like alchemy, right? So you take the nature, the predisposition, genetic predisposition, then an event in life happens, or reinterpret it as such, and that alchemy happens, and potentially, you know, some kind of addictive behavior gets formed because we run away from pain. Can you talk about trauma? Can you talk about those events that people call trauma? And, you know, coming from our background, which is, you know, for some of us, real trauma, Holocaust, genocide, this is trauma. Other people say, you know, they had traumatic childhood because their parents didn't pay attention to them. What is trauma, and how does it affect addiction from your?
Okay, so Patty, this is a complicated one, so please direct me if I start to.
I will.
And wander. Okay, so I would first of all, I think trauma is a very, very, very difficult thing to define. If people give simplistic answers to what trauma is, I would probably stay away from them. But I will try my best to define it, even though any definition of trauma will always be lacking, because it's difficult to put these things into words. But saying that, I would suggest that as human beings, we experience many things, and we experience many difficult things. There are some experiences we have that we can fully integrate. They can be terrible experiences, but we can integrate them. And what I would mean by that is that I can feel it. I can feel the feelings that get triggered in me by the trauma or by the event. I can think about it. I can understand it. I can understand the feelings, and I can even, you know, have put some meaning around it. Like, it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me in the world that I live in my narrative of an understanding of the world. And that would be called integration. I can fully sit with all aspects of the experience. And then there are some experiences which we can't, and that's because they are overwhelming for us. And these experiences end up causing splits or fragmentation, Patty, as was the word you use. I'll use the word split because that's what I use, but it's the same idea, that it creates splits within our psyche, within our personality, within our emotional and cognitive systems. And so I would suggest that this is trauma. So trauma is not an event. An event is not traumatic, because if I can experience an awful, awful event, but if I am lucky enough to be able to integrate that event, I will not be traumatized. But if I experience an event and I can't integrate it, as I discussed before, that will create a split within my psyche, and that's the trauma. So the trauma happens inside a human being. It doesn't happen outside a human being. If there's no human there is no trauma. So trauma is an intrapsychic phenomenon. It's something that happens inside us as human beings. I just might give two common examples of the ways general ways that these splits present, just to, again, try and make it a little bit more relatable. And this is true for, I would say, 100%. It's ridiculous to say 100%, but I'll say it anyway. 100% of the patients that I've seen, and I've seen thousands of people with addictions, I would say 100% presents in one of two ways. One way is that they are all cognition. They are all up here and they are totally numb to their feelings. They don't know what a feeling is because their feelings got shoved away 5 years ago, 10 years ago when they were 3, 5, however old they were. And so they walk around up here. And so this and this, the head and the heart become totally disconnected. And that's one way that a split occurs, that I forget what feelings are and I'm not aware of my feelings anymore. And that's called alexithymia in the fancy psychology and psychiatry lingo. But it's really a disconnection, it's a split. There's a big split between my head and my heart. The other way that splits tend to present is more the typical person of the typical presentation of a borderline personality structure, which would be overwhelming emotions. So I would also describe that as a split between here and here, because there is an overwhelming emotion, but this part of me doesn't understand what it is or why it's there. So I get triggered and there's overwhelming emotion, and this part of me just doesn't understand and just goes crazy. And that's again another very, very common presentation of what I would suggest as splits. These splits between between the different faculties within us. There are obviously then more severe splits with people that have had more severe trauma, like full-on dissociation, dissociative episodes, etc. But again, I'm trying to make it more relatable to I guess, the everyday person who would relate to having overwhelming emotions sometimes and may also relate to just being numb from emotions sometimes.
Eli, I think this is the good time. I want to keep also time in mind, but this is a good time to start talking about that window of tolerance, which is really the integration. Can you talk about that? What do you see in your practice? How does that integration, how do you heal the trauma? How do you heal the hurt? And how do you actually make people turn?
Yeah, so this is really about healing the splits. It's about healing the splits. So again, this is not an easy thing, and I don't want to just use words, because using words is interesting, but it's not necessarily relatable, because we talk, and Patty, you and me were talking the other day about integration and what that means, and really nice models for integration. But I wanted to bring an example of a real situation, because I think that's much more relatable, and I think from the example, hopefully, the idea of what a split is and what integration is might be more understandable. This is not a real person, because I wouldn't talk about a real person because of privacy issues, but it may as well be a real person, because this is what I see all the time. And I'm just going to talk about my own experience in my own hospital. So let's say someone comes in and I speak to them, and one problem that the person identifies is that she's always giving to people, always constantly giving, to the point where she loses her sense of self, and to the point where she gets resentments against everyone else because no one ever gives to her back what she gives to other people. And so she goes around the world with this fear underneath, because she doesn't have a sense of herself, and all this anger and resentment to everyone, which she can't express to anyone because she can't, because she has to give to everyone else. Anyway, so she ends up with all these confused and conflicting emotions. Then she starts drinking, and then she becomes an alcoholic. Okay, so she comes into the hospital, and the first thing we do is we take away everything. We're very mean. So we take away phones, we take away computers, there's no internet, there's no work. You can't even ring your family for the first 7 days. You can't do anything. And the reason we do that is because humans, we're so good at avoiding our emotions that we will literally use anything we can. If I have a phone, I'll start using my phone. If I can ring my family, I'll start ringing my family. They'll make me feel better. So we take away the coping mechanisms. And what happens then is the stuff starts to come up, and it starts to come up very intensely. Intense feelings and thoughts start to come up because they're no longer blocked. And so then let's say, for example, I'm doing a group therapy with this lady, and I notice in the group therapy that she keeps trying to help everyone. That's all she's doing. Whenever someone feels bad, she's just helping and helping and helping, and she's never focusing on herself. So then I'll say to her, oh, it's interesting, Melissa, why do you keep helping everyone? And again, because the compulsive nature of these the fact that this behavior covers over a painful emotion, she's not aware of because it's not conscious. So she will say something like, I'm helping because I'm nice. I'm a nice person and I help people. And then let's say I ask her, how do you feel? What feeling comes up for you? What feeling comes up for you when you see someone in pain? So let's say there are no defenses, and she can do this quite readily, which is very hard to do, but anyway. She sits with it and she says, oh, guilt. I actually feel overwhelming guilt. When I see someone in trouble, when I see someone in pain, I feel overwhelming guilt. It's very, very painful. And she starts to cry, and it's overwhelming, the guilt. And then I might say to her, well, that's very interesting that you feel guilt, because it's not actually your fault that other people are in pain. It's interesting that you feel guilt. And I might say to her, when does guilt go back to for your life? And then she might say again, if she's not very highly defended, which we all are, but anyway, she might say, oh, well, you know, when I was 5, my mum got depressed, and that was really hard for me. And I always felt like I had to look after my mum. And then I'll say to her something like, well, what did you feel when your mum was depressed? And let's say, and so she thinks about it, and all of a sudden she's like, oh, guilt. And the guilt comes up very powerfully, and she starts to cry. And then I might say to her, well, it's interesting, because what do you feel when someone in this group becomes sad? And she says guilt. And all of a sudden she has an integrative experience, an aha moment, which is, oh, that's what I'm doing. That's why I help people. I help people because I'm reliving this traumatic experience that I had when I was a child, when I felt so guilty with my mum, and I'm reliving it throughout my life, but I didn't realize it. And that integrative experience integrates things like, and this is what, getting back to the theory, integrates things like thoughts and emotions. So they are now integrated. They're not separate anymore. It also integrates things like her past and her present. They become one. So she understands how her past plays into her present. She's also integrating how she relates to other people and how she relates to herself. So all these different levels of integration, which is something that
there are 9 levels of integration that we know of. They're all very, very interesting. I think for the sake of time, we're going to end here with the conversation, but hopefully you have seen so far that we all have the hungry ghost, and I think the examples that Eli has been giving is just really showing that, you know, you can go to the extreme, but we all have had those experiences when we feel guilty, where we even with the phone, I mean, when you think about it, this addiction, which is addiction for a lot of us, is actually based on the same premises. And boredom very often, or feeling lonely, or feeling like we don't belong, people will immediately whip up their phones. And tech companies are really harnessing that attention that we give it to the devices. And I think we're going to open it up, and I give the word to Tania now to Q&A from the group, and we're going to answer as much as we can. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Well, firstly, thank you, both of you. I mean, really, I could sit here all night and listen to you. It's just really fascinating. And I wonder if we should think about doing a part 2 of this down the track later in the year, because I think there's a lot more that could be, a lot more questions that you could ask Patrycja and Eli. It was just really, really interesting hearing about your work, and having been to your hospital and seen that as well in situ is also very interesting. So there's questions coming through the chat, and I'm also just, I've got some questions that have been pre-listed. I'm just looking for those at the minute. I'll just go to one of those to begin with. Just one second. Okay, no, I can't see the questions that have been. Ilan, could you look at the questions, please? Thank you. Ilan, would you be able to unmute and read the question?
I'm about to do that now. There we go.
Thank you.
So the first question is, from a person who is asking, I am addicted to pleasure. What do I do?
Well, maybe that's a tongue-in-cheek one. Eli, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I think if life is going well for you, go for it. That's awesome. You know, that's great. If life is not going well for you, if your addiction to pleasure is ruining your life in some way, then exactly what we've been talking about, you have to look for the pain. There will be pain underneath it. Even if you don't know it, And this, you know, and I hate saying this to people because it sounds ridiculous to tell them things, you know, as if I know them better than they know themselves. But all I know for sure is that underneath addictions for pleasure is 100% there is pain, which is...
Sorry, Eli, you just muted
Yeah,
yourself.
sorry. There is pain, which is the fuel for the addiction to pleasure. So that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Look for the pain.
Okay, that's great. That's great. I'm going to pick one from the chat feed now, Ilan, and then we might go back to the pre-submitted questions as well. This is a question. Is the success of AA due to its insistence on feeling one's feeling and finding meaning?
It's a big question. First of all, there is a fascinating, this is just relevance. I'm going to bring it in. It's just a little bit to the side of the question. There's a fascinating connection between spiritual experiences, psychedelics, and AA. And for people that don't know this, I would encourage you to look into it. AA actually started when Carl Jung tried to treat an alcoholic. And Carl Jung told this alcoholic that he needs to have a spiritual or religious experience to heal from his alcoholism. And this is exactly where psychedelics come in, to be able to facilitate these experiences. And maybe it's on AA's focus on spiritual experiences that is part of why they heal. But I would also say that being able to use groups, and I think people can heal through addiction through relationships. And that might sound ridiculous and corny, but it's true. Because, I mean, we didn't speak enough about, well, anything about self-esteem, but the ability to be able to overcome your fear and your shame, and to be able to start sharing yourself and showing yourself to other human beings, and being honest to other human beings, and being accepted and loved, you know, for your flaws, is extremely, extremely healing. And that's part of why I think AA and NA, etc. In addition to the steps and all the healing work, and there's a lot of reasons, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
No, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
Ilan,
if I can add to that, I think the university, what we see coming up from the psychedelic research, especially MDMA-assisted therapy, is that sense of love that people get, that very often they have never felt in their life. Love and acceptance, and ultimately being held by something bigger. And we had this conversation with Eli, I think 2 days ago, and I said, I don't know if you thought about it, continuation of a conversation. I said being held, having a bigger cup to hold the pain. Which means very often we feel like our body is too small and we need to reach out for somewhere else for the pain to to pour out the pain, if you wish. The psychedelic experience, or even experience with another human being, holds the pain. There's a bigger body. There are two bodies now holding the pain. Nature is amazing. Nature also, it's a bigger body. We talk about body of nature, right? Holding the pain, or holding whatever is coming, or the emotions which seem so overwhelming that the system either goes into, you know, overload, the chaos that we were talking about, or complete shutdown because it's just too much. And so I love that concept of the cup and holding, and some of the Peter Levine actually uses the term. He says, if you can hold your pain, and he's a trauma specialist, he says, if you can hold the pain, let me hold it together with you. And I think that therapeutic relationship with two people holding each other pain is something absolutely beautiful, and we really need as human beings.
that's fantastic, Patrycja, and it's really interesting when you think about it in terms of the psychedelic experience, that you have this incredible feeling, for example, with MDMA therapy, that you're being held in something that is so much bigger than yourself, this incredible feeling of oneness and bound, you know, you are part of everything, everything is part of you, and so your cup is enormous, right, for that time, and that's why the therapeutic window that you were talking about is able to open a little bit more. There's another one here. And what we might do now is, there's so many questions. So we're going to do quick questions, quick answers. So here's, and either of the two of you can answer them if you want. But maybe take it in turn so you're not both answering both. So this next question, are there ever positive addictions? Eli? Yes.
I work with high performers. I work with high performers. And so, you know, my addiction, my hungry ghost has been, you know, never enough of knowledge. And so, you could say that this drove me to, you know, degrees or whatever. And so it's just it's a coping mechanism. That's why I don't think, you know, for me actually to stop and make it not be a hungry ghost, you know, being a workaholic was actually going back to the pain. And where did that pain come from? That I throw myself into work. Was it positive addiction? I guess, but it was still a hungry ghost. It was just, you know, with a lips.
And it's interesting, I think, you know, maybe we're seeing comments in the chat feed about part 2 is a great idea and so on. And maybe in the next one, it could be very interesting. We, you know, Patrycja has done her PhD on the Holocaust. And this could be an area of interesting, you know, further conversation as well. As the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors myself, I found these medicines to be incredible for dealing with the trauma that we're experiencing. And we're all experiencing some collective trauma right now with COVID as well. So it could be very interesting to look at part 2. Ilan, your next question.
So my next question is, people are wanting to understand the space of addiction in Australia, and is there any shift towards a holistic view or theory? I know that for my son, he went on a spiritual journey which changed his mindset and in turn became a journey of personal growth from there.
I feel I don't like to answer questions pessimistically, so I first have to think of something positive and then I can give my answer. There are significant problems. There are significant problems. For those of you who have had some experience in the Australian mental health system, you'll know that there is, and I mean, it's probably the same overseas, you know, addiction and mental health are called dual diagnosis. There's a term in the industry called dual diagnosis, which is it's always bothered me, because if you have depression and OCD, or if you have anxiety and PTSD, or if you have an eating disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, it's not called dual diagnosis. You don't get these, you know, dual diagnosis implies that there's two things and they're separate, and we're making these two diagnoses and somehow we don't know how they fit together, but they're just both there. And I think that is symptomatic of a very big problem, which is that for some reason, addictions are not seen as the same as other mental health problems. And I think that's the first issue that that I'm trying to address, and hopefully other people will as well, because they are, you know, you can't separate them, but for some reason we do as a society. So that's the first issue. There's always issues of money as well. I think one other issue that I have is that I feel that there's a significant divide between addiction research and the clinical experience of clinicians that work with people with addictions. And this is also, I think, a very significant problem, that the research tends to be very much based in cognitive and behavioral paradigms. And then as a clinician, you sit with someone with an addiction and all those very smart sounding incentive salience and a dopamine, all this stuff, it just becomes irrelevant because you're sitting with someone who's been traumatized since they were 6. So there also seems to be a really significant divide between addiction research and what the actual addict's problem is. And the issue is that addiction drives policy. Addiction drives policy, maybe it does. Research drives policy. And while there is a significant disparity between the research and the clinical findings of people with addictions, you know, that's a very significant problem. And on a positive note, you know, what we need are people like Peter and Tania to come in and shake the system up. And this is exactly what we need, because the system does need a bit of a shake up. And so it's people like Tania and Peter that are I think, you know, that can possibly help a lot, coming in from the outside and maybe, you know, shaking the system up a bit.
No, thank you for that vote of confidence. It's lovely, Eli. And so there's questions here on, you know, where do psychedelics fit into this framework? And I think I spoke a little bit about that just before, but Eli, I think it would be interesting just very briefly to hear from you as to how you see psychedelics psychedelic medicines or psychedelic assisted therapies fitting into the framework that you're talking about, and Patrycja as well. And I'm seeing lots more part 2 would be brilliance here, but there's like another 23 or more questions. So we're not going to answer them all, but we'll try and get through them. It's like speed dating, speed questions.
I'm just seeing so many amazing questions. I think part 2 would be a good idea just to combine, because even the question you just asked is a huge question,
I know,
because we can look from so many levels, like what's happens on the neuroscience level, what happens to the meaning of life, because we start seeing that suddenly values change for people. You know, brain works in a different way. It's just, there's such a depth and wealth of knowledge that we have right now, that I think will make sense to just got those questions and do part 2 so we can prepare and dive deeper.
Well, no, that's a good idea. Let's see some others that we can answer quickly. What is the difference between addiction and psychological dependence, Eli?
That's hard because I'm not exactly sure what the person means by psychological dependence.
All right.
I mean, I could talk about what I think they mean, but I'm not sure.
No, that's okay. We can skip for that, or they might put more detail in the chat. Patrycja, could you recommend? Sorry, go on, Eli.
I mean, look, I'll just quickly. They might mean like dependence on, like, for example, codependent relationships, or like a dependence. I have a psychological dependence on a partner. And for those of you who are into things like attachment theory and early development, you know, one really nice way of understanding addiction is that it is an attachment disorder. In other words, there's something about how I attach to other human beings which got disturbed when I was young. And I continue that same way of attaching to other human beings. And I can use other people. It's not nice to say it, but I mean, it's the truth, and truth is important. I can use, you know, we can develop psychological dependencies, for example, to other human beings that function on a psychological level exactly the same way as addictions do. And I don't see a difference between them. There are some, I don't see a significant psychological difference. There are obviously some differences in the brain chemistry and the learning, etc. But on a psychological, emotional level, I would see them as exactly the same.
Okay. Patty, can you recommend a book about the 9 levels of integration that you mentioned?
Sorry, I just muted myself and then I muted myself. Yeah, so that's Dan Siegel's work. I think is brilliant. He's a neuroscientist at UCLA. Beautiful work, such a gentle work. His first book is Mindsight, and his latest one is Mind, the Journey to the Heart of Being Human. And I think the way how he describes it there, and I was telling Eli, I have intellectual crush on him. I've sat in so many of his workshops, and just the amount of notes I've taken, and I keep rereading them, and it's just such a wealth of knowledge. He's one, and my another intellectual crush is Gabor Mate, who wrote In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts and many others around addiction. And I think his approach is also such a, he actually does work with serious addiction in Vancouver. He talks a lot about ketamine and, you know, but beyond that, he just really explores and dives very deep into the pain. And some of his books are, because I gifted them to many people, and people are like, I can't read this stuff. And I'm like, you can't read it, like, why can't you read about pain? Which is really interesting, because he does write harshly about pain, but you know, who said that? Write boldly and courageously about the things that hurt, and I think he does. And so those two, I would say, if you're able to read those two and actually finish them, you're like an addiction expert.
There's a question here, Eli. As a parent, how can you assist your children with unpacking pain when they've closed down emotionally as a result of trauma and have very low self-esteem?
That's an amazing question. It's a very hard question. It's a very hard question to answer without talking to the person themselves. But I will. But I will. But I won't. I think it's really, really, really hard. You know, being in a family myself. Also a family that shares similar trauma to other people here. I can say that I think it's very difficult to open. It can be very difficult to open up to family members. It can be. Some people can do it and some people can't. The best thing I can suggest is to show the person a lot of love and support. which is not an easy thing to do. It's very, very, very challenging to overcome one's anger and resentment and guilt and shame and actually show a child love. So first of all, I would think in myself, can I actually show them love and be honest with myself? And if I can't, maybe I need to see someone to work through my own resentment and my own guilt and my own shame so I can actually show them love. And just really try and show them love and support. But also, you know, boundaries are also very important. You know, without boundaries, people will just, you know, children can walk all over us. So boundaries, but shown with love, is very important. And try and find them good help, which can be hard to find. But yeah, I don't know if that helps.
And I would just add to self-esteem. I get that question a lot. Children actually, you know, they mimic us. We are the best role models, and they will pick up on things that we don't even realize where we self-sabotage and where we fall short. They will pick up on the difference between what we say and what we do, that dissonance. And so I would say it starts with oneself, especially as a parent. Can you be, what is your self-esteem? And I think really diving into that, how honest are we with ourselves? How much can we sit in our own pain and be vulnerable with others? That is, I would start there, and then everything else that Eli said.
And just Patty, just a very quick answer to this one is, why do you think psychedelics, I mean, it's again going back to the earlier question, but since we are Mind Medicine Australia, I do want to just touch on this point. Why do you think psychedelics are so effective in targeting the points of disconnection you described and Eli described?
Well, you can look at it from neuroscience level. It, you know, pretty much the whole brain kind of lights up. And then I think just that overwhelming, you know, it's funny because my ex-husband used to walk around New York City, actually, and he was in finance, and he used to ask all those very, very serious people, big investors, and he used to say, what's the underlying structure of reality? And I thought that was a nuts question to ask people. But people, you know, people would answer. And universally, across the board, no matter who he spoke to, whether it was people at Burning Man or people at hedge funds in New York City, they say it's love. And I think what psychedelics do, they peel off those layers that we have built up, and we actually connect to something that transcends age, gender, whatever it is. And that feeling held and feeling loved and feeling accepted, which is ultimately self-esteem is about believing I don't have to be a human doing. I'm enough as a human being. And I wish we had more kids who are raised like that, you know, you don't need to get the A's all the time or score 100% because you're worthy just as you are, or I am as I am.
And Eli, thank you very much. Eli was going to add to that, I think, as well.
I just wanted to say one more word, because it's all the same stuff, but just to say one more word. And this is what I really noticed, you know, because I've sat with people for years, literally like 5 years to do therapy with people and work through their trauma. And what I noticed on that documentary, which you guys filmed.
Trip of Compassion, yeah.
Yep, Trip of Compassion. I think trust is a major aspect, because it takes trust to be able to open up to oneself and also to open up to another human being. And it seems that some of these medications give people a sense of trust. And as anyone who's ever read some Erik Erikson, I don't know if anyone's ever done that, but the most basic, you know, what he suggested was the most basic human experience is either trust or mistrust. And if we can develop trust through a medication, I think that has something very significant to why people can heal.
Yeah.
If I can add to that as well, that is just literally just to a quote from Einstein, actually, who said, you know, the question is not whether God exists or not. The question is whether we believe the universe is malevolent or benevolent. Does the universe and the world conspire for us or against that? And that thing literally wires our brain, wires our nervous system, and how we see the world. So yeah, it goes, trust, super important.
I'm just going to answer just a couple of quick questions on our certificate course. It is available to, I think it is available to palliative care nurses, to Bevan Dewar. So please apply, because obviously those nurses are working with end of life trials and end-of-life treatments, which Patrycja talked about at New York University and Johns Hopkins. And of course, there's an end-of-life trial taking place at St. Vincent's Hospital at the moment too. So if you are a palliative care nurse out there, please apply for the certificate. We do want more nurses, mental health nurses and other nurses, nurse practitioners applying. Is there a general feeling that psychedelic therapies can broadly treat people with comorbidities such as depression and alcoholism, or anxiety and complex PTSD? I mean, yes, there is, but Eli, did you want to talk to that at all?
I would love to say something about that, because, I mean, look, again, we could go on for hours about this, but there is an issue as well with how we understand mental illness and DSM diagnoses. DSM diagnoses are not valid diagnoses. I don't know if that comes to a shock for people. DSM was created to create reliable diagnoses, and all that means is that one person, a psychiatrist in America can look at the same person as a psychiatrist in Australia, and they will both diagnose the same person with depression. That's called reliability. DSM is not a list of valid diagnoses like appendicitis is. So in other words, when you say someone has depression, all you're saying is that they fulfill the criteria of depression, which is that they can't sleep, they don't feel well, you know, they feel crap, and they don't have energy. That's all you're saying. It's like a circular argument. They have depression, you feel sad because you have depression, but all the diagnosis of depression is that the person feels sad. Psychiatric diagnoses are very, very important, and I'm not bashing psychiatry. I use them all the time, and I treat off psychiatric diagnoses, and I give people medication. I'm not like some crazy whatever, but there is a misunderstanding of psychiatric diagnosis. Someone who has depression and anxiety and alcoholism, all that means to me is that they have a lot of sadness, they have a lot of fear, and they are somehow trying to deal with their fear and sadness with alcohol. And that's all it means to me. So yes, 100%, and that they will all be connected somehow, because we're always at the root of us. We can always be integrated somehow. So yes, I would definitely, absolutely be of the opinion that psychedelics could heal everything, because everything is connected. They're not
Yeah.
separate. I wouldn't see them as separate.
No, it's just finding that wholeness. So questions for next time. We're getting questions for next time. So clearly we have to do part 2. In fact, someone's even suggested part 3. Patrycja, I'm conscious you have to go, but we have a few more slides. And Eli hopefully will stay for a couple more minutes. We're just going to show the final slides in our next webinars. Patrycja, please call me soon so that we can work out a date for part 2. And we'll just quickly, Ilan, put on the last couple of slides and wrap this up. There's some wonderful comments on the chat, which I encourage you all to read, and we'll share the webinar. Next webinar, please bring at least 2 other people with you, and we'll just show you these last slides, Ilan. Thank you. So this is Tim Ferriss's recent quote about supporting these therapies. And he says, and I don't know why that's gone a bit, I can't see that properly, but I review the next 5 years as an absolutely golden window to support and invest in this area. Next slide, please. And how you can help. So start conversations, share this information with your contacts. If that's looking blurry for you, I'm terribly sorry, it's looking blurry on my screen. We have volunteering options, there's educational content in our wonderful Learn section of our website. We have wonderful downloadable information. Please talk to your doctors and medical professionals. Talk to your local MPs. Fundraise or donate. Peter and I donate our time and our money to this. We have no profit motive whatsoever. And we really encourage you to join our supporters circles, from small to large donations. Everything is valued, and we run on the smell of an oily rag. So I can promise you that it will all make a difference. Follow us on social media, attend our events. Next slide, thank you. This is about the certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies. There's great information on the website about it. The next slide. Our psychological support services. So if you are using these medicines and you need some help with integration, or other types of counselling support. We have a wonderful integration support service and other psychological support services all around Australia with excellent psychotherapists and psychologists and others providing support to you. Next slide, thank you. And this is the summit for next year now, which is being moved to next year. The introductory workshops, though the 2-day pre-summit introductory workshop may still go ahead this year, depending on government regulations. Next slide, please, Alan. That's the wonderful lineup of speakers we have, and there'll probably even be more next year. And the next slide, which is our upcoming webinar. So next week we have another not next week, in 2 weeks we have another very interesting webinar on healing addiction through psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine and ibogaine-assisted therapies. And I think that will be fascinating as well with Dr. Nicola and other people. Then in September, we're looking at the pathways for making MDMA and psilocybin-assisted therapies available in Australia. So we'll be talking about the SASB scheme and the rescheduling process. And then in later September, we have a very interesting webinar presented by Dr. Anna Rubinstein, one of our advisory panel, on the rites of passage, psychedelic therapy as a rite of passage from mental illness to mental health. So we'll go back to the screen, open up all the gallery so we can see you and wave to one another. And thank you all very much. I want to thank Eli, I want to thank Patrycja for their wonderful contribution tonight. I thought it was just very inspirational, and we're getting wonderful feedback about this. So please join our upcoming webinars. Eli will be in touch about another date. And thank you for your support, and thank you all for joining us and being a part of our webinar series. And please spread the word and bring at least 2 people with you next time along, and keep supporting us. And thank you for spreading the word about this incredibly important work far and wide. May these medicines be available to help all of those who need them as soon as possible. Thank you all. Have a great evening, or if you're in another part of the world, a great day. Thanks so much. Take care.